So, um, where we left off yesterday, talking about the Great Depression, which was a global event. It affected most of the industrialized world and other countries as well. All felt the effects of the Great Depression, this economic downturn. Some countries worse than others. The United States being one of those, where unemployment rate at a particular time reached up to 25%. We talked about Franklin Roosevelt, who was the president during most of that. It started under Herbert Hoover's administration and then carried into Franklin Roosevelt's, who started a lot of different programs trying to lift the United States out of the Great Depression, trying to boost the economy, trying to stimulate the economy. He was a sort of the mindset of that Keynesian economics, that the government had a guiding hand and needed to help stimulate the economy and create demand for products to help businesses. The other side of that is largely, more of a, that is sort of a bottom up approach. So we help the little guy, we help the people, start, getting products again, and then it works its way up. The other and sort of what's sort of the conservative idea about economics is sort of a top-down approach, where we hear about like trickle down. So if you help businesses and you eliminate regulation and things like that, then freeing up business to do business, they'll employ people. And there's problems with either side of that. With Keynesian economics, you tend to have businesses through taxes and things like that, reinvest in their businesses. Of course, you have a lot of government spending, which is a big problem and can create debt and create an issue there. On the other hand, with the other side, leaving business to do business, there's not always a motivation for businesses to reinvest in their companies. Make sure that they're, employing people and stuff like that when they're left to their own accord, or for that matter, just to do the right thing. Anyhow, so that's what's happening in the United States in the 1930s. We wanted to turn to parts of the world here that's going to be particularly important when it comes to World War II. So that's what we'll get to today, at least covering how we get into another great war. Remember, World War I was called the War to End All Wars. That's why it was called the World War. It was this global war. There wasn't going to be anything else like it. Unfortunately, they should have seen this coming very shortly after World War I and the Treaty of Versailles, that things were not improving as far as relationships in Europe and in other parts of the world. It's going to lead us into a worse war than World War I. So in particular, we're going to look at Germany to start with. So as I mentioned, along with the global depression, the Great Depression, Germany was one of the countries that was hit hardest. And that helped give Adolf Hitler his rise. He had tried to come to power in the 1920s. He attempted a coup against the Wehrmacht Republic and marched on the capital in what was known as the Beer Hall Putsch. And he was arrested and jailed and had to basically come out of that and sort of start over. But he was a very passionate speaker and a charismatic person that people tended to flock to. Right or wrong, they listened to his message. They agreed with his message, and slowly but surely he was gaining influence and power. And then in 1933, he becomes chancellor. So again, thinking about what all led to that, we mentioned before that Germany had basically been embarrassed by the Treaty of Versailles after World War I. the world came down hard on Germany, blamed them basically for World War I, and basically punished them the most through reparations that they had to pay for the war, taking territory, demilitarizing. There's this part on the border of France and Germany, the Rhineland, that they were not allowed to occupy, put troops in. And so it created this environment that was right for someone like Hitler, that was going to make Germany great again. So because the economic troubles and all this, he's made chancellor in 1933 and immediately begins consolidating power. So, it had been a republic. It had a government somewhat similar to the United States, where you had, separations of power, but Hitler is eroding those barriers between that, and he's consolidating the power under him. So while there's still like a legislative side and all of this in Germany, it is mostly by name. He is going to be the authoritarian. He is going to be a dictator and determine Germany's fate. So very quickly, within a few years of his becoming chancellor, he is rearming Germany against the Treaty of Versailles. He remilitarizes the Rhineland. He puts troops and occupies the Rhineland in March 1936. And everybody's looking sideways at Germany of what's going on. Unfortunately, nobody is really doing much about it. There's historians and people will talk about this appeasement of Hitler in the 1930s. And if we could have stopped him or slowed him down, perhaps we could have intervened and not have the atrocities that we did in World War II, not have the death toll and another great war like we had just finished up, just 20 years before. And they point towards Neville Chamberlain, who was the British Prime Minister before Winston Churchill, who was the British PM at this time. And they allowed Germany to annex Austria, basically make Austria a part of Germany. Now, Austrians are basically ethnically German, or Germans are ethnically Austrian, whatever you want to look at. They're very similar. They speak the same language. And Hitler believed that land belonged to Germany. And also he takes this part of Czechoslovakia called the Sudetenland. And Europe basically lets him do it. Now, part of the issue there is, could they have actually done anything to stop him? Were they ready to stop him at the time? The appeasement policy was largely because there wasn't a whole lot else that they were probably able to do at the time. And the other thing is, as I mentioned, the United States is worrying about itself. It does not get involved again after World War I in European affairs, outside of trade, economics, diplomacy, but they're not going to get involved in something like this, at least obviously not yet. And everybody else is sort of dealing with this global economic depression. So it's a good time for Hitler to sort of fly under the radar for a little bit, consolidate power, and start taking land and creating this continental empire in Europe. So that's really his idea. What he wants is something called Lebensraum, which is living space in English, for the German people. He wants a big land where they can, they can thrive and they can expand. So that's where Austria comes in. That's where the Sudetenland comes in. And then we'll see when we get to World War II, a lot of the rest of Europe comes in. He also signs initially a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, with Joseph Stalin, to keep them from intervening if, Germany decides to, say, invade Poland or, invade France or something like that. So there's a tentative sort of agreement between those two early on. That's not going to work out for the Soviet Union eventually. And along the way, one of the things that Hitler continues to do, which he's done since the 20s, was basically blame the Jewish population in Germany for the ills and woes of the German people. He, for starters, there were a lot of Jewish people that worked in banking and had businesses, so they were lenders, they were creditors, and of course, so when the economy started going south, those were the people that Germans owed money to. And Hitler was able to point them out as being like, this is part of our problem with our economy, is the greed of the Jewish people. It goes hand in hand with his other ideas about race. Germans, he believed, were the master race, the Aryan race, and he wanted a pure society of German people. So the Jewish population obviously did not fit into that. And he became increasingly hostile towards those Jewish communities. So, just blaming them for whatever problems were happening in Germany, eventually seizing their property, seizing their businesses. This idea and effect that we see from time to time called the othering of people. When you point to this group and you remove their humanity and you blame things on them. And the more you do that, the more you can convince people that, these people are less than human and they are deserving of your ire. And that's what was happening in Germany. So before the war, this was all, coming about. Berlin hosted the Olympics in 1936, I believe. And, Americans went over there, the rest of the world went over there, and everything seemed fine and dandy. Most of the people that came back and said, well, everything seems okay over there. But what we know what's going to happen is eventually it's going to move from just hostility to open violence and basically kidnapping the Jewish community and the Jewish people and imprisoning them in internment camps, work camps, and death camps. And by the end of World War II, what we estimate was a couple million at least Jewish people put to death. Most of which occurred in those concentration camps. But that is basically what is happening in Europe, at least this part of Europe. We're going to talk about a little bit different part of Europe here in a second. But Hitler's rising to power rather quickly. He's rearming Germany. He's strengthening the economy. And he's telling the German people that we're going to be the best. So there is, again, what is popping up, what is rearing its head is nationalism. In the case of Germany, it's the nationalist Nazi party, Nazi Socialist Party of Germany. And that's the other thing, is that we basically have a situation where there's a one-party state. The Nazis control Germany. They control the politics of Germany. So what else is happening in Germany is the rise of fascism. And that's a word that gets thrown around quite loosely. Today, everybody anymore seems to be Hitler or they are a fascist. Donald Trump was a fascist, Barack Obama was a fascist, George W. Bush was a fascist, and Black Lives Matter, they're all fascist. Antifa somehow, anti-fascist or fascist. Everybody they use that term really loosely, and it's just just supposed to be this deplorative term. Unfortunately, there is a real definition for fascism. And our basically creator of fascism is Benito Mussolini, who was the prime minister of Italy after October 1922 through to 1943. Mussolini came to power very aggressively during the seize of, it was a seize of power during the March of Rome. So sort of like what Hitler attempted with this beer hall putsch in Germany in the 1920s. But for Mussolini, he was successful. He marched on Rome, which is the capital of Italy, in 1922. And at the time, there was a king in Italy that appointed the prime minister. So the king removes the setting prime minister and installs Benito Mussolini, who brings the ideology of fascism with him. Now, there's very certain characteristics that goes along with fascism. It's known as a far right political ideology. So, we throw these terms around again. So, it's supposed to be a spectrum of sort of political ideas. And if you're leaning left, honestly, if you get too far in either direction, it tends to be problematic. But on the left, it tends to be more progressive ideas. Typically relies more on sort of government intervention and government involvement in affairs. Again, the sort of progressive ideas moving forward. The farther right you go, the more conservative you go, which is basically thinking about, well, the old ways were better. The way we did things in the past was better. We should stick to those. Conservative ideologies tend to be, when you get the farther right you go, more sort of religious fundamentalist ideologies, less government involvement, and sort of throttling government spending to some degree. There's also tends to be more nationalistic ideas. If you lean left, you tend to be more of a sort of globalist, thinking internationally. If you're leaning right, you tend to think more nationally. And that is certainly what is happening with fascism, is very, very socially conservative. I want to say socially because necessarily when it comes to sort of other affairs, they really like the power of the state, which Hitler did, what the state can do for people. And it is this ideology in fascism that the good of the nation means more than the good of the individual, which is a little bit different than sort of other right-leaning, really conservative ideas. A lot of times also really promote the individual, but not in this case. It is very hostile towards democracies, towards liberalism, towards communism. So they are not friends with the Soviet Union. It is, again, a one-party state, right? Fascism is the party of Italy, and they're in control. So there's no democracy. And again, being the sort of far-right mentality, these ideas of progressivism and liberalism don't jive in Italy. And it is very militaristic. You will see Mussolini most of the time dressed in like a military uniform. I mentioned before, sort of like jingoism, this idea where you have a very militarized foreign policy towards others. Italy is expressing that. And it's very sort of masculine, right? It particularly speaks and engages young men. And that's part of Mussolini's ideas, is this is where you engage people. And this is where it starts, is with boys and young men. You set them straight and everything else takes care of itself. Franco's Spain is largely fascist. It is not quite as hostile. It does not get involved in World War II. Officially, like they are not fighting the Allies and they are not hostile, but there's some certain alliances and there's things that happen behind the scenes. If you're, say, a pilot that gets shot down in France, if you're an American pilot that gets shot down in France, you make it to Spain, you may or may not make it back to the States or to your unit. Spain might help you one time, but then somebody else might get turned over to Germany. It just kind of depends. And a lot of sort of this ideology is adopted by Hitler. He really likes the ideas that Mussolini is putting forth. It is Hitler. It's not a fascist party in Germany. It's the Nazi party, but there are a lot of things that parallel fascism that's occurring in Italy. More conservative, ultra nationalist, really putting Germany first, putting the ideas of Germany first. Somewhat to the good of the nation over the individual, but Hitler does focus on the individual as well. He believes in family. That's how you get to that master race, is by investing in the family unit in Germany. Anti-democratic, yes, because there's only one party. Anti-liberalism, certainly. Very, very, very hostile towards communism, which is somewhat ironic considering that he has this alliance at the time with, or non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, but very hostile to those ideas. And that, again, will come back to bite the Soviet Union when we get to World War II. So this is what's happening in Europe. You have a very hostile leadership in Italy and Germany. They're really focused on growing their countries, empowering their nations. And in Germany's case in particular, excuse me, seizing land and seizing opportunities to take land. So these are two of your Axis powers, Germany and Italy. Of course, they're right next to each other, which makes it easy in Europe. There is another Axis power that's going to be in the Pacific that we'll talk about now, Japan. So Japan hits this stage in the 1800s where they had sort of, I guess a good way to term this is they were just kind of asleep. And the rest of the world were sort of starting to advance and pass them by in the early 1800s. And then some United States ships show up in Japan. The officer that was in command of these ships was Commodore Matthew Perry. You can see that was, about 7 years or so before the Civil War. But he was there to open up trade with Japan. He was trying to get, make these inroads to Japan to start trading, U.S. goods. And he had brought some U.S. goods with him on his ships. These were Navy ships, they were military ships, but he had things like, modern weapons, like guns and things that he was going to trade to the Japanese people. Well, the Japanese government and diplomats saw these great ships that the U.S. had, these very modern ships and these very modern weapons. And they were like, hey, I like what you got going on, U.S. I think we're going to do this too. And it started a period of very rapid modernization and industrialization in Japan. And it's known as sort of the part of those ideas are wrapped in this idea called the Meiji Restoration. So it wasn't just the development of Japan economically and technologically and all that, but the installation of the Meiji or the Emperor of Japan. So the Emperor of Japan is now the leader of Japan again. And there was lots of modernization for their military reform, and this overall growth that started there in the second half of the 19th century. Very rapid growth, and they start to get rather hostile towards their neighbors and other countries in the Pacific. And there's a series of conflicts starting in the late 1800s, and they begin to take land. So there was the first Sino-Japanese War that was the 1890s, 1894, 1895, where Japan started to seize territory on the mainland of Asia. The map here I have up. So the very, very dark green islands, that's the mainland of Japan. That's the home islands of Japan. The next sort of darker green color is where Japan colonized. They actually annexed territory and set up colonies. So the one part here next to China, that is Korea, the whole peninsula of Korea, which would today be North Korea and South Korea, and Taiwan. And the lighter shaded green areas are basically puppet states and protectorates. So they had Japan had control of these areas, nominally, or at least those areas basically answered to Japanese control. The next war, the Russo-Japanese War in the early 1900s, was really a coming out for Japan because they absolutely crushed the Russian Navy and Army in that war. And that is when they actually annexed Korea. That's when Korea basically became a part of Japan. And oddly enough, they had sided during the First World War with the Allies. So with Great Britain and France and then the United States, they were allied with them. They were not really fighting, but they had sided with them at that time because Germany had sort of gained a foothold in Asia. And they thought that by siding with Great Britain and France, these guys, that if Germany gets beat, then that will sort of loosen Germany's influence in that part of the world, which is exactly what happened. Germany couldn't, maintain any colony or anything like that in Asia at that time. So it worked out for them then. But they are going to flip, and they are going to be the third Axis power when we get to World War II. And the second Sino-Japanese War was, this is where we start seeing the very brutal regime of Japan. During the second Sino-Japanese War, one of the well-known atrocities during that event was called the Rape of Nanjing, or Nanking, depending on pronunciation. You'll see it either way. So after this battle near this city, which is sort of it's south of Beijing, and it's sort of like a provincial capital. So it's a large city. After this battle and Japanese forces occupy the city, they basically start mass murdering Japanese civilians and citizens of the city, and mass rape as well. The death toll is estimated somewhere between 40,000, over 40,000 to 200,000 citizens were killed in a period of about 6 weeks. As far as allegations of rape, it was in the tens of thousands. It was incredibly brutal and, of course, unnecessary. And it was not the only event. It was not exclusive to Nanking. There was other events that Japan was responsible for. The treatment of the Koreans was another. It's a long-held contentious point. Korea and Japan to this day have a sort of tense relationship. And a lot of that has to do with the history prior to World War II, particularly the treatment of women, but all Koreans. And Japan has had a difficult time trying to, sort of, you kind of say sort of what we've experienced with the Southern Reconstruction and sort of this memory of the South. Japan kind of struggles with its own memory when it comes to what it did in this era between the early 1900s until the end of World War II. And they did control very large swath of Asia, big parts of China, Mongolia, part of Russia at one point, Vietnam, Malaysia, and the Philippines. You can see all these island nations down here were basically controlled by Japan. So between Germany, Italy, and Japan, well, actually, let me finish with Japan here. So the other thing going on here that is this tension with the United States, because the United States also has a presence in the Pacific, namely at Hawaii, where we have a rather large naval buildup, which Japan is worried about. So there's, they're hostile towards, their neighbors in Asia. They're hostile towards the United States at this point. And when we get into World War II, we will see how that actually plays out. World War II, as I mentioned, is probably is the event that is most important to our world today, as far as shaping the world order, shaping conflicts that come after the war, shaping our relationship, particularly the United States, but honestly, every nation's relationship with each other was modified and changed and influenced by what's going to happen in World War II. As I mentioned, there's places where Japan has colonies and has control. I mentioned a place like Korea, and I mentioned a place like Vietnam, and that is going to, shake out during the Cold War. And we will talk a little bit more about World War II tomorrow, because I'm sorry, starting to get a little itchy here, the throat. But largely the idea is setting that stage. How do we get there? Had this World War in the start in 1914. Why did it not resolve the issues? How does this keep coming up? And largely it is about, again, to some degree, nationalism, and the personalities that are involved are really important. Do you have World War II without Hitler? Probably not. These aggressive sort of political ideas and fascism that pop up. And that was created to some degree by the economic issues at the time, and people looking for, a something to take, get them out of the situation they were in. And in this case, for Germany, it was Hitler, and for Italy, it was Mussolini. Fortunately for the United States, we had FDR, we had Franklin Roosevelt, but it could have easily been some other personality that could have been very hostile towards the world. Somebody that would look to blame the world for what was happening economically in the United States. Maybe we start blaming Canada and Mexico, or Japan, or whoever it may have been. And the outcome could have been a lot different. But that's largely when you start seeing this type of conflict occur, is when there's certain things happening like economic strife, and there's this, it creates a vacuum where there's, the wrong person can get control and greatly influence people, which is exactly what happened in Europe at the time, and as well as in Japan. In both cases, whether it's Japan, whether it's Italy, whether it's Germany, there's a sense of nationalism there. There's a pride in their country. It's going to affect them when it gets to war, because they are not going to be willing to give up, particularly with Japan. But tomorrow we'll get to how war actually starts in Europe. And then there has been fighting already in Asia between Japan and China, but the Soviet Union will get involved to some degree, and then of course the United States will also get involved, and that's when we actually have a whole global conflict. So, okay. Any questions about what's going on in the world in the 1930s? Oh, all right. So we'll take about a 10-minute break. Okay. Yeah, let's take about a 10-minute break, and then we'll work on some language arts today. We're going to work on some misplaced modifiers. So I'll see you guys at about 1:05.